He kōna e purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
It's wintertime in Aotearoa and the snow is falling. It's part of an annual cycle. In the spring, the snow will melt, feeding the rivers and lakes. But in some places, high in the mountains, the snow never melts. It sits there, accumulating, squashing down over time to change into ice. And then, when the ice starts to flow, a glacier. So there's an imaginary line you can draw along our highest peaks. Below this line, snow and ice melt. Above it, snow sticks around. This line shifts across latitudes and throughout the seasons, and also across time as our planet warms. Kia ora, nau mai haramai ki te ao hurihanga. Hello and welcome to Our Changing World. Ko Concannon tēnei. Picture a crisp, sunny, blue sky Queenstown mid-March day. The sharp edges of the remarkable mountains are in the background, and I'm milling around with some scientists on an airfield. Before us is a small plane branded with Milford Sound Scenic Flights. And our flight is going to be scenic, but we're not Milford bound.
Yeah, we're going to get up in the air and we're going to head towards Park Pass Glacier, which is sort of to the west of here. And then we'll start making our way north along the Southern Alps, along kind of all the glaciers and taking photos of them. And then we'll make our way back down towards Mount Cook, take some photos of the glaciers in there, and then back to Queenstown.
Can you introduce yourself for me?
Yeah, my name is Lauren Vargo. I'm a glaciologist and climate scientist at the Antarctic Research Center at Victoria University of Wellington.
And how many glaciers are you going to be looking at, like photographing today?
Quite a few. So this is part of the annual end of summer snowline survey. And so that started in the 70s with 50 glaciers. But it's changed in those 40-some years. So some of those original 50 glaciers no longer exist, so we don't photograph them. But we've added quite a few glaciers. And so we've added even other glaciers that aren't really part of the survey, but that we figure it's good to take photos of while we're up there and can always use that data in the future.
Added glaciers. So this is not the glaciers have suddenly materialized. It's just that you've decided to include them in the survey now.
Absolutely. When the survey first started, it was someone called Trevor. And so Warren right there, Trevor was his father. He passed away 5 or 6 years ago. And so he would go up in a small plane and take photos of glaciers. And I think my theory on how he picked them is just picking glaciers that were kind of small to medium sized then, so they would easily fit in the frame of a photo for him. And so now, if you can imagine kind of smaller medium glaciers 40 years ago, some of them have pretty much just become snow patches. Yeah.
And so you've picked up some of those bigger ones
exactly.
that have now moved into the small to medium category, or are you able to photograph bigger ones now?
Both, yeah. So we've picked up some that have now become small to medium, but we can also use kind of the methods that I'm using to take lots of photos of one glacier that might not just fit in one frame and then create kind of a stitched 3D model of it.
Sweet.
Yeah.
And so how long are we going to be in the plane today?
Oh, well, hopefully we'll be back around 5 or so. So is that about 8 hours? But we'll have a nice break for lunch. Yeah.
There's no in-flight service on this plane or bathroom. So we've all been a bit strategic about the coffee intake this morning. I clamber into the little 14-seater with my gear in tow. I always love a window seat, and in this plane, it's all window seats. Lauren is threading some wires along the length of the plane.
And so I don't know, I think you can grab any of these seats. I'm not sure if we've got anyone in specific spots yet.
Okay, and what are you doing?
I'm just setting up the GPS right now. And so it's good to get it set up ahead of time because the longer it runs, the more accurate it will be. And so this is a unit that's connected to a little antenna just on the other side of those guys there at the dashboard of the plane. And so that makes it possible for us to know really precisely where we are. And so then we can know really precisely where each photo is taken from. And that makes it possible to make these 3-dimensional models of all the glaciers that we're taking photos of.
We'll get back to Lauren and the 3D models in a bit, but now it's go time. we sweep up into the blue, heading out over Frankton and Arrowtown, across the Crown Range towards Mount Aspiring National Park. Our pilot today is Andy Pye, and in the navigation seat is Dr. Drew Laurie. He's a principal scientist of climate and environmental applications at NIWA, and he's been coordinating the end-of-summer snowline survey since 2009.
In years before I arrived, there was a very small survey team, typically Trevor Chin plus one or two other people on a small aircraft. And it was done as a multi-day flight because of the smaller aircraft and their range being limited. Now, we've progressed to a much larger aircraft and a larger team of people who are making contributions. And we've also narrowed our range. We don't go as far south and we don't go quite as far north because those glaciers or patches of snow are now, functionally dead, and they don't really tell us anything for that year. So it's not worth burning the jet fuel to go that far out. So we get it all done in a day now.
The plane might be bigger now, but it's still not big. And it's loud. We've all got earmuffs on. On the right-hand side, there are two small window slots that can be opened, enough for a camera lens to be popped out. Lauren sits by one, and Gregor McCara, another NIWA climate scientist, is by the other.
You happy with the approach, Gregor? Go for it, Lauren. And we'll do a slight 5-degree turn. Go for it, Gregor.
And this is how our morning unfolds. Cruising over the southern mountains with Drew directing our path from one glacier to the next. When we get close, Gregor and Lauren open the windows, and Andy banks the plane, dipping the wings so they have a perfect view and can take as many shots as possible as the plane flies by.
Yep. Okay, wingtip up, Andy. Thank you.
We've been flying for a few hours, and it's time to stop for lunch. The original plan was Hokitika, but the weather's not really playing ball on the coast, so we divert to the little airport at Tekapo.
What do you think, Gregor? So far, so good?
So far, so good.
Getting stuff?
I honestly feel a little ill. The glaciers and mountain peaks are breathtaking, but with the loops and dips and windows opening and closing, it's far from a smooth ride. But I stuff down a sandwich anyway and catch up with another member of the survey team.
I'm Warren Chin, and I work for the Department of Conservation, and I come along on these snowline flights almost as ballast, I guess.
As ballast, you're just weighing out one side of the plane against all those people who are on that one side taking pictures.
It's true. There are some linkages here with why I'm on the snowline flights. Primarily, my father, Trevor Chin, established the whole circus back in 1977 and had been flying. He did 42 or 43 flights himself before he died in December 2018, which is very sad, but Drew Laurie had already taken the game over prior to that and just continued and invited me along, and I was also doing some climate change work with Doc, and it all dovetailed quite nicely together, so that sees me coming along on the snowline flights, and I take as many photos as I can as well.
It's an incredible legacy that your dad kind of started these surveys and that it's still going today.
Well, he was a meticulous archivist that was developed from his time with the North Canterbury Catchment Board, where you had to keep very good records of water levels, recorders and so forth. And he's just a very orderly-minded person, quite eccentric, but orderly-minded nonetheless. and he saw to it after he'd been to Europe. He went to a conference in glaciology in Riederalp in Switzerland. And there he got talking with Fritz Müller, the late Fritz Müller, a Swiss glaciologist. And they were then developing this idea of a glacier inventory in a way in which they could estimate the volume of ice and change. And so from that conference, he came back home and started to discuss the ideas with the New Zealand powers that be. He was working for the Ministry of Works at the time, the Water and Soil Division. And the Ministry of Works was a big organisation, and so it had cash aplenty, and so at that time it was no problem. So he was working on the Tasman Glacier, doing ostensibly water resource management for the hydroelectric scheme, but really it was glaciology.
In 1965, UNESCO launched the International Hydrological Decade to encourage a coordinated international approach to understanding water problems. And New Zealand got involved. Because he was already doing the Tasman Glacier work, Trevor was Johnny on the spot, as Warren puts it. He focused in on the Ivory Glacier as a contained water basin to study.
And while he was doing the Ivory work, he also developed the glacier inventory work, which was a program to count up all the glaciers we had. Everybody thought we had a couple of hundred, there's one or two in the North Island, and then there's the Franz and the Fox and whatever. And so, no, he did a concerted effort to enumerate all the glaciers with specific criteria and surface area, and it had to be given elevation, and the ice had to persist for at least 5 years. And once they got their criteria worked out, then they jumped in a plane at the very end of the summer, because this is the end of the glacier year, the glacier season, when the snowline is at its very highest. So anything left behind is either a permanent patch of snow or it's a piece of glacial ice that's actually moving, it's flowing under gravity, under its own weight. And so they flew around and they got 3,154, I think, was the total in 1977.
Today, that number is down to an estimated 2,900 glaciers. But for Trevor, the question back then was, how could you go about keeping an eye on what's happening to these glaciers?
Because the ideal principle that he used to explain was the best thing you could do is pick up a glacier and weigh it before the previous year, before the winter, and weigh it after the winter. And so you want to capture the total accumulation of mass, and you want to capture the total loss of mass, as we call ablation. But that can't be done. You can't go and pick up a glacier, nor can you pick up 3,154. So he had to develop a proxy system, and he determined 51 index glaciers that were absolutely perfect because they were at the lowest elevation possible, where they were still glaciers, and some of them were the largest ones where they had the largest volume. And with these metrics, he could then fly around at the end of summer and photograph the previous summer's snow line. And that line is really significant because it usually sits 2/3 of the way down the glacier. 0.65 is the standard ratio. 0.65%, or 65% of the glacier is accumulation, and the balance is ablation. Once you've got that metric, you fly around and you measure the position of the snow line using that. And if the snow line is above it, well, you've got a glacier that's disappearing. If the snow line's below that line, you've got a glacier that's either in balance or advancing. Advancing is probably rare, but imbalance is common.
While I've been talking with Warren, I can see Drew over his shoulder, pointing at a watch and at the plane. We're on a tight schedule, so we load back in and climb high over Lake Tekapo and towards the mountains to the north.
This will get very rough in here, unfortunately. Sorry, guys.
We zig and zag, do weird dog legs to get good shots, and circle around some of the peaks.
It's like the path of the traveling salesman. We want to try to get it optimized so that our mileage is as low as possible and we hit as many customers as possible. And also putting us in the best position to capture their portrait from the same location that they've been shot every single year. You've got to get the position of the aircraft right in the air, so that everybody can get their shots that they need. And some of these sites that we're taking photographs of, we're doing loops around, and that is allowing folks like Lauren to make three-dimensional models with those photos.
Keep looping. This is a loop glacier. Okay. Thank you.
Some years we've got an absolutely perfect flight where there's no cloud, absolutely brilliant conditions, we've hit the right day, and also after that we start getting the first snows. So basically we hit the window properly where we've got ahead of the first snows of autumn and we're not obscuring the true end of summer snow line. The other side of the coin is that we push it out and we've waited too long and we're dealing with really crummy weather conditions when we're flying, cloud cover, and there may be a skiff of snow that's come in and obscured the summer snow line, and we're not getting the best data that we could get. Nevertheless, most years are pretty good, and the flight that you were on this year was, I think, a pretty good one in terms of what we were able to see, and we got all of the glaciers and all the shots bar maybe one glacier terminus.
Yeah, the end part, or terminus, of the Franz Josef Glacier was blocked by cloud when we flew over. Drew and Gregor spent hours poring over topo maps and previous photos of the glaciers to build a flight plan. They have these printed off beside them to refer to now, because when you're up there, it's quite difficult to distinguish one glacier-containing peak from another. And there's a lot of ground to cover.
The initial index glacier data set had 50 glaciers in it, and of those we're somewhere in the low 40s for the originals, and we've added probably 10 to 12 more. In addition, we've started tracking some of the places where there's larger amounts of snow and ice being held, like the ice plateaus and ice fields. You know, Olivine Ice Plateau, Gardens of Eden and Ala, Bracken Ice Field, etc. And that's because we want to know about how those particular types of glaciers and glaciarized areas are responding. And the majority of our glaciers that we look at in the survey are relatively small. And the amount of ice that is held in New Zealand is held in a majority by 12 or 13 glaciers.
They also take pictures of the terminal positions of the large, well-known West Coast glaciers you've probably heard of, such as Fox, Tasman and Franz Josef. Well, when the weather allows.
The terminal position is an important aspect of a glacier that does reflect something about climate, but with a big glacier like that, there's an added complexity about its response time to climate. So it may be maybe a bit slower than some of the smaller glaciers that we survey. And in the case of Tasman, there's other complexities, like the fact that it terminates in a lake. The main aim, though, is to get glaciers of different sizes in different places around the Southern Alps to tell the holistic story of what's happening to our snow and ice. And those big glaciers are a key part of that story.
The survey is helping them monitor what's happening to New Zealand's glaciers across time. From the air, it's really hard to get the full scope of them, but even my untrained eye can spot differences. We fly over one that Drew calls a beautiful glacier.
There was just something about it where it was the juxtaposition of the ice coming off the really rugged mountain peak and the scenery that you could see in the backdrop and also in the foreground as well. It was just set absolutely perfectly, just perched there absolutely perfectly. And you think it didn't actually look really ragged. It didn't look like it had been hammered yet. It was a little bit higher up. And so you're thinking, okay, well, that kind of pristine view is, an expectation of a glacier, not, God forbid, like one of the smaller ones that has just been absolutely shattered. You look at Loreni Peaks, which is one of my favorite spots to look at. There used to be a lot more snow and ice up there. And again, that was once a beautiful little glacier, and it's unfortunately been hammered by warming temperatures. So a shattered remnant of its former self.
It will come as a surprise to no one that across his 15 years running this survey, Drew has witnessed big changes.
There's been significant loss of ice even since I started the game. It really is like I took the baton from Trev, and I got 10 good years with him over that period, 2009 to 2018. And during that time, things really started to take off in terms of accelerating loss of ice, rise of the annual snowline, and just dramatic changes in the alpine landscape that we have managed to capture on film.
The photos taken across the survey years clearly show this. The terminal ends of the glaciers moving up the mountains and their edges shrinking. But they're still 2D images, making it hard to capture the depth. This is what Dr. Lauren Vargo is working on. She's creating 3D models across time to estimate the volume of ice being lost, or in the odd year, gained. A few weeks after the flight, I catch up with her in her office in the Antarctic Research Centre in Victoria University of Wellington. She brings up the software on her double monitors and shows me some squiggly lines and black dots.
The squiggly lines and loops is the GPS points of where our plane flew for the snowline flight. And you can see that they usually kind of make these loops or kind of U shapes around these black dots. And so the black dots are all of the end of summer snowline glaciers, so the glaciers that are monitored as a part of the survey.
It's a very interesting looking flight path.
It is, yeah. It's really fun to zoom in and kind of see. Actually, I think this was
this little figure of 8 right there.
So like little eyes here. Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely did not take straight lines to fly past those glaciers. Okay, and then taking that GPS data, so that was what you fitted into the plane at the start of the day, was
Exactly.
to measure everything.
Yeah.
And now you're able to use that not just to recreate the flight path, but also that helps you with modelling the glaciers.
Yeah, exactly. And so this ties into a method that someone called Brian, who I work with, developed maybe 9 or 10 years ago. And so we use those GPS points together with a precise timer that he created that captures the time that we take a photo to the millisecond level. And so that precise timing, the GPS data, and the hundreds of photos that we take of every glacier make it possible for us to create really accurate and precise 3D models of each of the glaciers.
And that's what we're looking at now. Well, a 2D picture of a 3D model.
Yeah.
What glacier is this?
This is the Brewster Glacier, and so it's the only one that I've processed from our flight a couple weeks ago so far. And that's because it's the glacier in New Zealand that's probably the most studied, at least by us here at Victoria University.
And so this, what I'm looking at now, is like a composite of all of the hundreds of pictures that you took on that day.
Exactly.
Linked to the GPS data.
Yeah, and so we put it all into a software, and so the software reads in the GPS data, the photos, it finds points in each photo, and so having overlapping photos, it means that that point can kind of be triangulated, if that makes sense. And so the first step is creating this cloud, they call it, of points. And so that kind of makes up our glacier and the bedrock around it, all these kind of tens of millions of points that are ID'd from the photos. And then those points are interpolated to create our 3D modeled surface.
And you do this every year with this glacier?
We do, yeah. There's a handful of glaciers that we do this every year for. And so here I'll switch to the first year that this was done was 2016. And I'll just bring up that one.
A few clicks and there's a stitched together photo model from March 2016 and one from 2023. The software lets her mark the outline of the glacier, and overlaying the two of them, the difference is immediately visible, especially at the terminus. It looks like it's kind of walked back up the mountain quite a bit, and those edges have shrunk in too. But the software also lets her precisely measure what's been lost in terms of volume of ice.
In addition to these images that look like a glacier that we're seeing, we also get elevation models of the glacier that are really accurate and precise too. So here's what one of those look like. And so the darkest red colors show about 30 to 40 meters of elevation change from 2016 to 2024.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and what we're looking at is on the Brewster Glacier, it's quite a dark red down the bottom, down that terminus part.
Yeah.
It kind of fades and it's lighter up the top, but it's still
red.
It's like red to orange kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's representing just that loss in kind of thickness.
Exactly, yeah. And so the loss of the ice thickness. And so I was actually kind of more surprised than usual when I looked at this just a few hours ago. So at the terminus, there are places where this tells us that 35 meters, it's thinned by 35 meters in the last 8 years. And then I thought, oh, what is that? Because I'm not used to really thinking about meters in terms of vertical height. And then realized that that's about a 10-story building. So if you were on the surface of the glacier 8 years ago in 2016, you were a 10-story building higher than if you were on the surface of the glacier today.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it is.
That's really, that's kind of blowing my mind. I can't really equate that to the photos that you've been showing me.
Yeah. The scale is quite hard, even for me kind of working in this, to still comprehend, because here it just looks like this little
patch of ice.
Yeah, that fits onto my computer screen really nicely. And to imagine some person kind of being a little speck here is, difficult. But then to, think about having a giant building, and that's the kind of change that we see over just less than a decade.
we have focused in on the area with the most dramatic change. But when she runs the numbers, the average loss across the entire glacier area for these 8 years is 14 metres of water. She does this intensive modelling for about 8 glaciers. But when she says the Brewster is a focus for the uni, it's because it's one of 2 glaciers that scientists visit twice a year to take on-the-ground measurements. Lauren has been on these trips several times.
And so to think like every year I'm standing at the same kind of point if you look at a map, but in reality that point is getting kind of a few meters lower every year.
We know that glaciers are melting as the Earth warms. I asked Lauren how her research will help.
There's kind of, I think, 2 different directions of how I hope it helps us. So first is the glacier side of things. So glaciers are really important for things like sea level rise. So even though we talk about the ice sheets and sea level, glaciers have contributed quite a bit to sea level rise over the past few decades. Kind of more locally, glaciers in New Zealand can be really important for water resources, especially maybe in a drought year. So if there's a year when there's not so much rain, we still need water for things like agriculture and hydropower. So it's good to have those glaciers to get that water. There's also been a lot of work done, or some work done in New Zealand, on the importance of glaciers for things like tourism and outdoor recreation. So as the glaciers have changed, it's become harder to get around in the mountains. And then glacier change also impacts natural hazards. So we haven't seen this much in New Zealand, but there have been some big glacier melt events, both in Europe and in the Himalayas, where there's either kind of these big floods, which can destroy quite a bit of infrastructure, or even there was a big kind of glacier melt event in Europe in the last couple years, and I think a few people died who were maybe on the glacier or below the glacier as the glacier kind of had this big chunk of it fall off.
Now to Italy, where a heat wave may have been responsible for the partial collapse of a glacier that killed at least 7 people. 13 hikers are still missing.
So there's that side of why we care about glaciers. But then I guess I also hope that we all know that the glaciers are changing. We know that temperatures are warming. There's so much that we need to do about that we aren't doing. And so I guess that I hope that seeing climate change in this visual way, whereas it's really hard to see 1 degree of warming or some millimeters of sea level rise, it's really easy to see the Brewster Glacier retreating, maybe encourages more people to do something about climate change.
And I asked the same question of Dr. Drew Laurie, who, across his time doing the annual snowline survey, has been documenting the decline of these glaciers. How does it feel? And why keep doing it?
It's hard. It's really hard, but and that's the overarching and the overriding trend that we're on right now. There is variability around that, though. Where occasionally you see a year where it's like they held their ground mostly, okay? And those are few and far between, but then we get to ask the questions why, and then that helps to inform us about what's going to happen in the future along these different trajectories that society can choose to take with respect, for example, their emissions profiles, and what you might get if you took one of the middle roads instead of the high road, so to speak. And I think that it's worth talking about that. And I think it's worth talking about not only from a social perspective, but there are still many things that we don't know about glaciers, and it is worthwhile observing them and continuing to observe and monitor and measure them.
Thanks to Dr. Drew Laurie, Dr. Lauren Fargo and Warren Chin, plus the other Snowline Survey flight team members. Ko Concannon aho te kaihotu o tēnei hōtaka, I āwhina mai a Liz Garton rawa ko Ellen Rikers. I produce this episode with help from Ellen, who works on the show with me, and with Liz Garton, the executive producer of Our Changing World. Sound engineering was by Mark Chesterman. For some amazing photos from the flight, more information about the survey, and links to other related episodes, check out our webpage. It's at rnz.co.nz/ourchangingworld. And if you want to get in touch, you can email us at ourchangingworld@rnz.co.nz. I dropped a promo into the feed earlier this week, but just wanted to give another shout out for a new video series released on the RNZ website. Turning the Tide is a 6-part video series funded by the Sustainable Seas National Science Challenge. And it's about the stresses our ocean ecosystems face and what we can do about them. Visit rnz.co.nz/tide or find the videos on the RNZ YouTube channel. Tēnā koe I whakarongo mai. Thanks so much for listening. Ko Claire Concannon aho. Have a great week. Kia pai, the wiki.